gentlemen, join MythVision's Patron not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patron, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. One of my Patron fans, Michael Baca, asks, Derek, one for Dr. MacDonald. What are the clearest examples of Homeric or other Greek influences like Euripides on the Gospels and Acts that can be easily dismissed by scholars as examples of parallelomania? Does the lack of current scholarly acceptance of your ideas an example of what Thomas Kuhn called being locked into a paradigm that doesn't permit other types of evidence to be considered? Seems like a common problem in the guild you use, as you term it, where scholars as diverse as Robert Eisenman, James Valiant, Richard Carrier, as well as countless others don't even get a hearing or a mention in scholarship. It is as if other ideas aren't even possible to consider. Perhaps you have some comments on this phenomena and how this could possibly change in the future.
Michael, that's a great question. But first, Derek, thank you for having me on this show and for taking an interest in my work in the past. And it's a pleasure to have you here in Southern California.
Thank you.
Michael, your question is very good, and it, of course, would require an answer longer than I'm able to give you right now. All disciplines have their matrices. And that is, students are taught according to certain recognized patterns. You have it in the sciences, you have it in the humanities, and it's inconvenient truths that often get scholarship to move from the paradigms that it's familiar with and that students have used to craft their careers. And so there's a lot at stake in a paradigm shift. And I understand that, and I grew up with those paradigms. But as I worked, I realized that there was so much Homeric imitation in the New Testament. And I want to just give you a little biographical background to how that happened. When I was a student at Harvard, my minor was Latin reception of Greek philosophy. And I began to love classics. But one thing that became clear to me is that the entire absence of the Homeric epics from biblical scholarship was unacceptable, because the Homeric epics were the defining literature for Greek speakers, but also, and even in the Roman Empire. Furthermore, we know that mimesis, or literary imitation, was the way that people not only learned to compose, but they learned to craft alternative identities, such as Virgil's Aeneid rewriting Homer. And so the entire absence of the Homeric epics and mimesis from the methodologies of New Testament scholarship seemed to me to be a major shortcoming. And when I was teaching at Harvard as a visiting professor, I renewed my friendship with one of the great Homeric scholars of all time, Albert Lord. And I became encouraged by him to pursue the Homeric epics and early Christian texts. And my first salvo into that was to the Acts of Andrew. And I published 3 books that were related to that. But I found it also frequently in the New Testament. Now, the 3 examples I'm going to give you of the clearest examples of mimesis are going to be these. First, I want to talk about the death of Hector and the death of Jesus. There are so many similarities, and they match the criteria of mimesis criticism, which you apparently are somewhat familiar. And that is, Jesus dies alone as a young man, tragically. He thinks his gods have abandoned him, or God has abandoned him, just as Hector realizes that his gods, especially Apollo, have abandoned him. 3 women watch the death of Jesus, according to Mark, from a distance, and you have 3 women who mourn Hector in the Iliad, Andromache, Helen, and Hecuba. You also have the rescue of a corpse by Priam, so he has to get Hector's body from Achilles, and he ransoms him at night. But the difference is obvious, that Hector's body stays in the tomb and Jesus' rises from the dead. No one has satisfactorily answered given an alternative understanding of those narrative parallels apart from Homer's Iliad. And Virgil imitates the same story for the death of Turnus at the end of the Iliad. So we know that this story was popular. It had been similarly imitated, and there's reason to think that the author of the Gospel of Mark wanted to make the point that Jesus rises from the dead, whereas Hector stays in his tomb. Another striking example is the woman who anoints Jesus for his burial, which is very similar to Eurycleia washing Odysseus' feet and recognizing her master. Another spectacular example is the Gerasene demoniac and Polyphemus. Jesus sails to a shore. He finds a man no one can subdue living in caves. There's a lie about one's identity. Odysseus says that his name is Utus, meaning nobody. And the Gerasene demoniac says that he is Legion because there are many demons that are there. Jesus turns the soldiers into swine the way Circe turns the soldiers into swine in the Odyssey. You have, there are so many examples that I could give you, Mike, that I think would satisfy your question. But I appreciate your attention to this, and it is painful for me to realize that the discipline that I love so much and have contributed to, it has a tin ear to mimesis and classical Greek poetry. And I actually am somewhat embarrassed that the mimesis critical orientation and the use of Homer in the New Testament gets so closely identified with me. I'm simply a beggar who found some bread and is interested in sharing the bread. You don't, the beggar doesn't deserve as much credit as sometimes is given. These materials are there. They're inconvenient facts to my discipline, but the way science changes is because of inconvenient facts.
So as you go into the future, and Michael's question, just to conclude this particular episode, Michael does ask, perhaps you have some comments on this phenomenon and how it could possibly change in the future. So as we're closing, how can we change this? What do you think the course of action should be?
I know that most readers of the New Testament cannot become classicists and read Homeric Greek, which is very difficult. So we need to have publications that make that more accessible. And I'm preparing a major reference work called A Mimetic Synopsis of the Gospels, in which I give my own translations of Homer or Euripides or Sophocles, and help the reader see the parallels and make their own judgments about how they could be connected. In some cases, maybe it's simply cultural influence, that Homer influences the culture and Mark parrots it. But I think it's more intentional than that. I think that early Christians were carving their identity by evoking not only Jewish scriptures as the canonical past, but also the Homeric epics and Athenian tragedy as a canonical past.
Thank you.